Welcome to the Book Club of California's online and in-person program titled Larry McMurtry's Runaways, the story of Larry McMurtry's collection of books by women travelers. Now, my name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all in the club rooms and on Zoom and host the program this evening. Now, for those of you that might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal and club newsletter for our members, and we have keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, book history, California history, book culture, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining or rejoining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to learn more about the book club, to join, or to donate. And now, tonight's program. Tonight's program is titled Larry McMurtry's Runaways, the story of Larry McMurtry's collection of books by women travelers. And our speaker is John Crichton. John Crichton has been an antiquarian bookseller since 1980, when he began working at Serendipity Books in Berkeley, California. In 1983, John purchased the Brick Row Bookshop here in San Francisco, one of the oldest antiquarian book firms in the United States. And it should be noted that from 1953 to 1971, the Brick Row Bookshop was based in Austin and Houston under the proprietorship of Franklin Gilliam, about whom the Book Club of Texas actually published a book in 2014 titled Franklin Gilliam, Texas Bookmen, which was edited by John Crichton. Now, John has also been involved in leadership roles of numerous bibliophilic organizations and institutions, including the Book Club of California, the Bibliographical Society of America, the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, and for 6 years, John served as the chair of the board of directors at Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. John has given numerous lectures over the years on subjects related to the antiquarian book world. At the book club in 2017, he delivered a lecture titled Anton Roman, San Francisco's Pioneering Bookseller and Publisher. And it was the inaugural Kenneth Carmiole Endowed Lecture on the History of the Book Trade in California and the West. He is also the author of the book club's 2019 keepsake titled Henry Evans, Bookseller, Printer, Publisher, Printmaker. Now, tonight, John Crichton will share the story of writer Larry McMurtry and his collection of books by and about women travelers. Over a 50-year period, McMurtry's collection of these books grew to almost 2,000 volumes and contained 320 years of travel narratives, from 1690 to 2010. Tonight, you're going to hear the story of the collection, what happened to it, and the women travelers who made it so captivating, women whom McMurtry himself occasionally referred to as his runaways. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please wait till the end of the lecture. We should have time to do a little Q&A, and we'll do that from you here in the club rooms and from you out there on Zoom. And you can use the chat and the Q&A functions on Zoom if you have any questions or comments, and I'll relay those to the speaker at the end. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, John Crichton.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the President, Board of Directors, and members of the book club for the invitation to speak this evening about Larry McMurtry and his collection of books by women travelers. It is always an honor to be behind the podium at the book club, one of the outstanding bibliophilic organizations of its kind. It is especially so this evening with so many friends and colleagues in the audience, both here and online. Thank you, one and all. My talk is in two parts. I'll begin with background about Larry McMurtry as a writer and a bookseller, followed by Larry as a collector, the building of his collection of books by women travelers, what happened to the collection, and then we'll look at some of the books themselves. I'm going to go through a lot of material at a steady pace, and there may be questions along the way, but as Kevin asked, please hold them to the end. And I'm going to begin first with just a brief explanation of this little yellow square with a simple image of the stirrup that you see beneath the title of the talk. That was Larry's book plate with a depiction of the cattle brand that the McMurtry family used on their ranch in north central Texas. And the book plate was in all of the books in his personal library. And here is Larry standing on that ranch in 1997. Larry McMurtry, who died at age 84 in 2021, was a prolific author primarily of novels and memoirs, almost all centered in his native Texas. The more than 20 novels he published included The Last Picture Show, Terms of Endearment, and Lonesome Dove, bestsellers which were made into popular movies and television series. His memoirs include the wonderful account of his upbringing in the small town of Archer City in north central Texas with the quirky title, Walter Benjamin at the Dairy Queen. Larry was also a prolific screenwriter. Beginning in the late 1960s, he wrote hundreds of film scripts by himself and in collaboration with others, culminating in the great success Brokeback Mountain, written with Diana Ossana, for which they won a 2006 Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. Indeed, the income from writing film scripts for Hollywood studios, as Larry readily acknowledged, supported his career as a writer of fiction, and it supported his comfortable lifestyle. The income from Hollywood also supported his other career, one for which he was less well known to the general public, that as an antiquarian bookseller. Larry was a bookseller of old, rare, and scholarly books and first editions. And here's a later photograph of Larry in his bookshop. Larry's deep, multifaceted life with books began in childhood, and it blossomed into an interest in used, antiquarian, and rare books when he was in college in the late 1950s. At Stanford University in 1960, as a Wallace Stegner Fellow, Larry became entranced by the multitude of used and rare bookshops in the San Francisco Bay Area. He had never seen anything like it. And he began accumulating books, not just to read, but also to potentially resell. Years later, he wrote, quote, "My days have always been, to one degree or another, book-filled, but never more than in my first year in San Francisco. There were more antiquarian bookshops there than I could possibly cover, but I did my best and hugely enjoyed the hunt," end quote. Thus began Larry's life as an itinerant book scout at age 24 and his budding desire to someday be a bookseller as well as a writer of books. After a fruitful year at Stanford, Larry returned to Texas in 1961 and published his first novel, Horseman Passed By. Soon after, made into a movie HUD with Paul Newman. He secured a job teaching English at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, and in his spare time, he traveled across Texas, the Southwest, and made a couple of return trips to Northern California, all in pursuit of his new passion, the acquisition of old books. With a post office address in Fort Worth, Larry issued his first catalog as a bookseller the following year under the name Dust Bowl Books. It was a 2-page mimeograph selection of the books Larry had purchased in his travels. Dust Bowl Books list number 2, issued shortly after, shown here, has the subtitle, Scouting Books on the Plains or Across Texas with Merle Johnson and a Tootsie Roll. Merle Johnson is a reference to the handy-sized bibliography, first editions of American authors, that booksellers and book scouts often carried with them when they traveled. The Tootsie Roll is a reference to Larry's bad diet. At age 25, Larry was beginning to think of himself as an author and bookseller. And here, some years later, he writes about it with a somewhat facetious title, Splendors and Miseries of Being an Author Bookseller. In 1965, Larry accepted an offer from Rice University to teach creative writing, and he moved to Houston, where he also found a job working as the manager of the Bookman, an eccentric local rare bookstore. Around 1969, Larry said goodbye to Texas and moved to Washington, D.C., where with partners Marcia Carter and John Curtis, he opened an antiquarian bookshop in Georgetown at 31st and M Streets. They gave their shop the catchy title, Booked Up. Booked Up would thrive there for over 30 years and become a legendary hunting ground for book collectors, dealers, and bibliophiles of all types. During those Georgetown years, Larry continued his peregrinations. He opened branches of Booked Up in Houston and Tucson. He regularly traveled to Hollywood to write screenplays, and he continued to crisscross America by automobile, his preferred method of travel, in his pursuit of books, and entire bookshops in many cases. Larry estimated that in over 30 years, he had purchased the entire inventories of more than 25 used and antiquarian bookstores. An example of Larry's obsession for the acquisition of old books is here, where he is seen on a sidewalk waiting in the early morning outside the location of the Vassar College Library book sale. Larry wanted to be first in line. This was an article from the Washington Post, which Calvin Trillin also amusingly wrote about in a sketch for the New Yorker published the same year entitled Scouting Sleepers. By the early 1990s, the economics of the used and rare book trade were changing, and general antiquarian bookshops like Booked Up in Georgetown were gradually disappearing. Larry recognized this trend and slowly began to shift the book business back to his hometown of Archer City, where there was a lot of available space at affordable prices. Larry purchased the abandoned Ford dealership on Main Street, filled it with books, and soon opened Booked Up Archer City. And there's the old Ford dealership. Other buildings across the street were also soon filled with books, as Larry took over a substantial part of the real estate available in downtown Archer City and established what he hoped might develop into a Texas version of the famous town in Wales, Hay on Wye. And there's a place across the street where he had more books. Larry also, here's an interior shot. Larry also purchased and rebuilt a large brick house for his residence, a house that has been described as the largest home in Archer City, the Taylor Mansion. And it had one thing Larry sorely needed by that time: space for his personal library that had grown to an estimated 25,000 volumes. The books he acquired over 3 decades of bookselling, scouting, reading, writing, reviewing, and teaching. They were all meticulously arranged by author and subject, floor to ceiling bookcases in nearly every room, nooks and crannies, and up and down the steps. It reflected the home of an exemplary bookman, one for whom books were a way of life. What is less well known about Larry is that in addition to his writing and selling books, he had also quietly developed into a methodical book collector. Among the thousands of books in his home was a collection that stood out from the others, a collection he had built himself from scratch from the beginnings of his days as a book scout. It was a collection of travel narratives by women. While I'm certain that Larry would have resisted calling himself a collector per se, the implication of dandyism might have conflicted with his Texas ranching sensibility, but he did once write that his books by women travelers were, quote, represent probably the nearest thing to a collection as opposed to merely an accumulation that I have, end quote. Larry did not write at length about his women travelers in the manner some collectors write about the importance and splendor of their collections. In his memoirs, there are only a few paragraphs and passing references to the collection. And though the books, well over 1,000 volumes by the mid-1990s, were in plain sight for anyone to see in his home, not all of his friends and visitors were aware of the collection, which is understandable considering that the books by women travelers were only 5 to 10% of the books in the house. It might have been easy to miss them. In November 1998, this want list for women travelers arrived in the mail of the Brick Road Bookshop in downtown San Francisco, right around the corner. And it immediately made me aware of Larry's collection. The 20-page pamphlet format list was not signed and did not explain who at Booked Up wanted these titles or why, but it was clear that someone in Archer City, Texas, was systematically looked in search of books by women travelers, and all signs, of course, pointed to Larry McMurtry. Now, over the years as an antiquarian bookseller, I had worked on numerous collections of books by women novelists, women poets, women writers of all kinds, and the subject of women travelers intrigued me, but travel writing in general was not a specialty of mine, and I put it out of mind until I saw the collection myself a year later on a visit to Archer City in Larry's home. It was an impressive sight, and to an antiquarian bookseller like myself, an alluring, almost intoxicating sight. A large wall from floor to tall ceiling of shelf after shelf of carefully arranged 18th, 19th, and 20th century books, mostly first editions in very good to fine condition. A collection assembled with great care, knowledge, and a lot of time and effort. Though expansive as a writer in public, Larry was often hesitant and reserved in private, particularly with men he knew less well, which included me. And I did not learn a great deal about the women's writers during that visit, other than what I saw on the shelves, and what I saw left a strong impression on me. A few years later, when our paths crossed, I inquired with Larry about his intentions of ever selling the collection of women travelers. He responded, and I paraphrase, "Sooner or later, everything gets sold, but no, the collection is not now for sale." Again, in 2012, when it was announced that Booked Up was having an auction in Archer City to sell off large parts of its inventory, I wrote to Larry, wishing him well with the sale and asking if the women travelers would be included or if he had any plans of otherwise part with the collection. He politely responded that he had not been adding to the collection a great deal recently, but that no, they would not be part of the auction, and that now they were still remained not for sale. That was the last we corresponded about it. Over the next few years, Larry's health began to deteriorate. He was living more and more in Tucson, Arizona, and I did not bother him about the collection again. But I did not forget those books. And in fact, the collection inspired me to research the subject and assemble my own small offering of books by women travelers in this catalog I issued in 2017. Larry died in March 2021. I've been told that he left a note that said I was to be offered the collection of books by women travelers. But at the time, I was unaware of any such note, and I didn't hear from anyone about it. A few inquiries with Booked Up in Archer City elicited no responses, and I assumed the worst case scenario, that Larry's library with the women travelers would be sold en bloc and irretrievably dispersed. But in July 2022, by a most fortunate happenstance, I crossed paths with an old friend of Larry's in Charlottesville, Virginia, Mike Evans. And I asked Mike if he knew anything about the disposition of Larry's collection of books by women travelers. Mike speculated that the books were still in the house in Archer City, and that Larry's son, James McMurtry, the songwriter-singer, was no doubt looking to sell them. He put me in touch with James, and not long after, I was on a plane to Texas. The agent for the estate and I agreed upon a price for the collection. I spent the next 4 days packing. And about 10 days after that, 70 boxes landed in San Francisco at the Brick Road Bookshop. For 9 months, I cataloged, collated, and arranged the books on my shelves in chronological order by the date of publication. Once completed, the catalog was a little over 100 pages and contained detailed descriptions of about 700 titles, ranging in publication date from 1690 to 2010, or 320 years of travel narratives by women. And here's the collection once it was cataloged. That gets you down to the book truck, that gets you down to about 1925. The collection was then sold en bloc back to Texas, to the DeGollier Library at Southern Methodist University, where it now resides as the Larry McMurtry Collection of Books by Women Travelers. So why did Larry McMurtry build this collection, the only accumulation of his thousands of books that he referred to as a collection? What was so special, so compelling about these books? First, Larry had a strong, abiding interest in determined, charismatic women, women who bravely set off for new frontiers, who sought emancipation from staid lives, women who wanted to get away. His fiction is famously filled with women characters of this kind. He was drawn to them. Second, Larry was a great storyteller, and any collection of books by women travelers is full of engaging, well-told stories by strong-willed women. I also think that Larry saw in women travelers the same thing that English poet Mary Astle described in 1725 after she read the letters of her friend Mary Wortley Montague. She wrote, and I paraphrase, that women were more interesting travelers than men. Astle and McMurtry, separated by 2.5 centuries, both thought that women experienced and wrote about the world and its far off places in ways which men rarely did. Men were too busy warring, colonizing, exploiting, and conquering to have enlightened, interesting perspectives. And finally, the subject of women travelers is perfect for the obsessed bookman that Larry was. There were thousands of interesting books on the subject to pursue, as he proved with this collection. And that is what antiquarian booksellers enjoy the most, the pursuit of books. And as he crisscrossed America, Larry was able to add to his collection, at least in some minor way, in probably every one of the hundreds of used and antiquarian bookshops he entered. From my cataloging the books, studying receipts, invoices, correspondence, and comparing that with bits of information that Larry supplied in his memoirs, it is clear that the first acquisitions that became this collection were in the early 1960s. The collection slowly took shape, one and two books at a time, initially acquired without any intention that they were the beginnings of what would become a larger, important collection. Larry did not initially have a guidebook or a desiderata. He wrote years later that this copy of, that's the Gollier Library at SMU. He wrote later that this copy of Lady Anne Blunt's account of her travels across Saudi Arabia on camelback, which he purchased at the Holmes Book Company in Oakland around 1960, became a cornerstone of the collection. But at the time he bought it, he had no idea of that. Probably the first scholarly work that helped Larry expand and refine the focus of the collection was Dorothy Middleton's Victorian Lady Travelers, published in 1965. Larry was impressed with Middleton's work, and he encouraged his students at Rice to read it. It obviously influenced his thinking about women travelers as a subject. But for its first 30 years or so, the Women Travelers collection remained something of a disjointed assemblage, a growing accumulation of books without specific direction. That changed in 1990 with the publication by the Oxford University Press of Jane Robinson's Wayward Women, a Guide to Women Travelers. Robinson's admirable work of scholarship was the first of its kind. It cast a much wider net than had any of the previous works on the subject. She supplies brief biographical sketches with bibliographical checklists of about 400 women travelers from the 18th through the 20th centuries. As any collector would do, Larry compared what he had accumulated with Robinson's Wayward Women, and from that comparison, he produced a list of what he did not have and what he wanted, which I showed earlier. I will show you again. When comparing the two side by side, it is clear that Larry's want list is based on Robinson's Wayward Women. This is Larry's file copy, which came with the collection, and you can see where he scratched through ones he has acquired. The publication of Wayward Women was fortuitous for Larry for a number of reasons. It supplied the scholarship and the direction he needed, which coincided conveniently with the fact that Larry now had the space in his new home to organize the collection in one place. He could probably, for the first time, clearly see and record what he had. And Wayward Women appeared at a time in Larry's life when his income from his literary and Hollywood endeavors had risen substantially. He was, as he described it himself, flush. He no longer had to rely on acquiring one or two books at a time as he scouted bookshops across America. He could now afford to buy books at auction as well. And he sent his want list to high-end dealers like Maggs Brothers, Bernard Shapiro, and Haywood Hill in London, who were all eager to sell expensive travel books by women to the now wealthy and famous American author bookseller. Larry had become a collector in the traditional sense, and he actively pursued books for this collection until about 2010, after which additions slowed to recently published books and gifts from friends. So what is in this collection? As I've said earlier, I arranged the books chronologically by date of publication, which is how I will present the ones I'm going to be showing you this evening. That is not how Larry did it. He had the books arranged in the traditional manner, alphabetically by author and title, the way you would find them in a library or a bookstore. But to arrange hundreds of books, indeed thousands of volumes that are in a single genre in the order in which they were published gives you a broader perspective on that subject and its history. You begin to see trends that developed over decades and centuries that would not be obvious with the traditional author title arrangement. Among these books you are about to see are narratives by women archaeologists, botanists, missionaries, mountain climbers, pioneers, alleged spies, travel guides, scientists, and just curious adventurers. They traveled by automobile, bicycle, camelback, horseback, motorcycle, ship, stagecoach, sled, train, and on foot. Other than being women, the common denominator amongst these authors is that they were all adventurers who chose to write about their travels, thus making them reporters, journalists of the events, people, and places they saw. And on occasion, Larry affectionately referred to them as his runaways. I'm going to show you about approximately 35 titles, to which I've added a few images from the National Portrait Gallery and the National Dictionary of National Biography. These are all these books are by women writers. I will indicate where they are not. And I'll begin with the earliest book in the text, the earliest text in the collection, and bring us forward. In 1658, Quaker missionaries, Catherine Evans and Sarah Cheevers, set out for the Mediterranean to influence and improve the world as missionaries do. En route, their ship suffered through several storms and had to seek refuge in Malta, where the two ladies decided to distribute literature on behalf of the Quakers. At the time, of course, Malta was firmly under the control of the Catholic Church and the Inquisition. The ladies were detained, and they spent several years in confinement there, which they reported on through letters home. This is their story in its third edition of 1715. The first edition was published in 1662 while they remained incarcerated. This is one of the earliest travel narratives by a woman, in this case, a collaboration between two women in English. In 1716, poet and later famous blue stocking, Mary Wortley Montagu, traveled with her husband across Europe on a diplomatic mission to Constantinople, where she spent 3 years. She wrote about her experience as a woman in the Ottoman Empire in her Letters from Turkey, which were posthumously published in 1763. It was this work that inspired Mary Astle to write that women were more interesting travelers than men. While in Turkey, Montagu learned about the Ottomans' use of inoculations to prevent smallpox, among other diseases, which she introduced to England upon her return. The story of her travels, as the story of her life, is a fascinating one. Like Lady Montagu, Jane Vigor became a traveler when she accompanied her husband, Thomas Ward, on a diplomatic mission to Russia in 1730. Vigor paints a spirited portrait of the Russian aristocratic intrigue and romance she witnessed. She was impressed with the emerging westernized St. Petersburg and its extravagant building projects, but she was repulsed at the sight of the bleak existence of the serfs in the countryside. Lady Anna Riggs Miller's Letters from Italy, 1776, is the first published account of a grand tour by a woman. And it came with a perspective on the subject that would resonate with travelers and travel writers for decades. Miller's substantial 3-volume work was not only a guide to the traveler, but also a survey of Renaissance art and architecture. Playwright Lady Elizabeth Craven escaped a failed marriage in 1783 and went abroad in search of adventure. And for several years, she was a constant traveler crisscrossing Europe. In 1789, she published this account of her travels through the Crimea to Turkey, which she dedicated to her new significant other, whom she met along the way, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and whom she later married, thus making her the Margravine of Brandenburg. Lady Craven was, in every sense of the word, a runaway. In 1784, Hester Lynch Trail, longtime friend of Samuel Johnson and member of his circle, married an Italian music instructor, Gabriel Mario Piazzi, which was quite the scandal in Augustan London. To seek refuge from the innuendo and gossip, they ran off to Europe for 3 years, which she entertainingly records in observations and reflections made in the course of a journey through France, Italy, and Germany, published in 1789. Mrs. Piazzi's lively narrative became a stylistic model for future women travelers. In 1790, poet Helen Maria Williams traveled to France for 5 months to observe firsthand and write about the nascent French Revolution, which had enthralled so many English writers and political activists. Letters Written in France was published shortly after her return, in just weeks following Edmund Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. The critical reception was generally positive, except in conservative circles, which included her publisher, Thomas Cadell, who refused to publish a sequel. In all, Williams wrote 3 narratives of events in France, published 1790 at almost 1800, 1815, and they provide some of the most valuable eyewitness accounts of those turbulent decades. In 1794, Gothic novelist Anne Radcliffe traveled to Europe with her journalist husband for a picturesque tour of the Low Countries and Germany, which she recorded in her A Journey Made in the Summer of 1794. But as they progressed into Germany, they found they were in the middle of the Franco-Prussian War. They stayed in towns that had recently been under siege. They passed armies of both countries on the pockmarked roads, heard gunfire as they dined at an inn, and were accused of spying. They attempted to get within view of an active battlefield, but their sensible coachman refused to take them there. All of which Radcliffe reports on in a matter-of-fact fashion, as if it were all commonplace. She is an example, an early example, of a woman reporting from a war zone and from personal experience. In 1795, Mary Wollstonecraft, the famous author of The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, traveled to the Baltic on an unusual destination for a woman at that time, as was her reason for going, which was to resolve a lawsuit with a Norwegian businessman who had allegedly swindled her lover, Gilbert Imlay. Thus, the purpose of Mary Wollstonecraft's travel was business, and it has been suggested that this is the first travel narrative by a woman traveling on business. Rachel Charlotte Diggs also traveled alone to France 2 years following Helen Maria Williams in 1792, and she remained there for almost 4 years, during which time she witnessed the revolution at its grim climax. At one point, she was arrested on charges of spying. Her impressive memoir of this experience, published in 1797, is distinctly royalist in tone and dedicated with extreme deference to Edmund Burke. Biggs reports on what she saw as the negative effects of the revolution on the lives of everyday French citizens, the shopkeepers, clergy, and farmers. And she scolds the English partisans of the revolution as being naive. She calls them the literary Benedetti and the Robespierreans. As we move from the late 18th century into the 19th century, One of the most interesting of the early travel writers we come to is Maria Graham. Here's an image of a portrait of her at the National Portrait Gallery. She published her first travel narrative, a journal of the residents in India, in 1812, where she traveled with her husband, a sea captain. Maria Graham went on to write about travels to Italy, Brazil, and Chile, and she was a keen observer. Some of her critics said almost too keen in detail, but she wrote about the local cultures, religions, antiquities, flora, fauna, and geography. Her books were particularly well illustrated, often with engravings based on her drawings, as this frontispiece is. She is the first woman traveler who ventured to several distant places and wrote about them, as opposed to a writer of a single travel dialogue about a single place. Novelist Charlotte Ann Eaton traveled to Belgium in 1815 to witness firsthand the Battle of Waterloo, where her brother was going to participate in the battle. He survived, and she wrote about it in this account, told with a novelist flourish. It was enormously popular, going through several reprintings and a new edition years later. Now, it's about this time, 1815, that the grand tour of the 17th and 18th centuries, as it had been traditionally thought of, comes to a close. And the following book is a sign of that transition. It is France by Irish novelist Lady Sydney Owenson Morgan. By 1816, Napoleon was gone. The French monarchy was restored. There was improved transportation from Dover to Calais, and France suddenly became a popular destination for a new class of English travelers known as tourists. And Lady Morgan traveled there to write about this recent phenomenon. France is an interesting work of reporting on French life and society, colored by Morgan's sympathies with the republicanism of Rousseau, Lafayette, and Helen Maria Williams, among others. Her book, in which she was assisted by her husband, was immensely popular, and the publisher contracted Lady Morgan to travel to Italy to write a similar book about life and society there, which she did soon after. I think a case can be made that Lady Morgan is the first woman to be paid for travel writing. That is, the first woman professional travel writer. We turn briefly to Maria Graham. This is her second travel narrative, an account of the time she spent in the mountains east of Rome. And it's a wonderful story revealing of the adventurous and fearless nature of its author. In the summer of 1819, she and her husband ventured to the village of Poli near Tivoli to escape the oppressive heat of Rome, but where it was known that the roads and villages were controlled by the dreaded banditti. Foreigners were discouraged from visiting this region, and that apparently appealed to Maria Graham. For the summer of 1819, she documented the local history, personalities, and nature of the people who were considered bandits, and she managed to do it unscathed. And these are other illustrations by her as well. And there she is dancing with a bandit. And here is an image from her journal of a residence in Chile during the year 1822, a journey which she had to complete without her husband, who died at sea en route. This is the second of two works by Mary Holderness on the Tatars of southwestern Russia and Ukraine, based on her travels there over several years. Her narratives are objective, factual, and thorough reporting, but interestingly told in the third person, and she reveals little about herself or why she traveled there. Novelist Frances Trollope, the mother of novelist Anthony and other literary Trollops, traveled to America in 1827 with her children in tow to assist her friend Frances Wright at a utopian colony in western Tennessee. Mrs. Trollope was appalled by what she experienced there and quickly moved on to Cincinnati, which she used as a base where she traveled throughout the states, recording her impressions, which she published in 1832 in Domestic Manners of Americans. Her work was bitterly criticized in America, particularly in the South, due to her dim view of slavery, but it was popular in England, and its success encouraged Mrs. Trollope, whose income was dependent on her writings, to become a professional travel writer. In 1829, American Abby Jane Morrill accompanied her husband, Captain Benjamin Morrill, on his voyage of commerce and exploration from New York to the Pacific via Cape Horn, with stops in Hawaiian Islands, New Zealand, Madagascar, and the Cape of Good Hope. Her narrative of the voyage, published in 1833, is one of the first accounts of circumnavigation of the globe undertaken and written by a woman, in which she interestingly compares her experience to that of previous explorers, including Cook, La Perouse, and Kotzebue. She also emphasizes that her narrative benefits from her woman's perspective of life at sea. Alison Carmichael's domestic manners and social conditions of the white, colored, and Negro population of the West Indies is about life in St. Vincent and Trinidad in between 1820 and 1826, where she lived with her husband, a Scottish plantation owner. Her narrative describes the landscape, architecture, religious institutions, and administration of the islands, as well as her perception of the plantation system and slavery, for which she and her husband fled in 1826, when uprisings by the slaves made it impossible for them to continue to live there. But whereas the books we've seen thus far are travel logs and travel narratives in the traditional sense, Mariana Stark's Information and Directions for Travelers on the Continent is a guidebook in the modern sense, and it is a pioneering one. Stark recommends places to stay, where to get the best meal, what to see, the most convenient modes of travel, sample itineraries, exchange rates, etc. Stark's work became a model for the later guides of Baedeker and John Murray, and indeed, it is the model for the travel guides we use today. He went through numerous editions until her death in Milan in 1838. Mariana Stark was the first English woman to earn an income as a writer of travel guides. Harriet Martineau's Society in America is a famous commentary based on her travels here in 1836, 1837. In it, she evaluates the government, economy, rural life, slavery, religion, and the rights of women, among other issues. She traveled to many of the same places that Fanny Trollope had visited before her, but her treatment is somewhat more journalistic and scholarly in tone. She would write similar works about other parts of the world, most notably the Middle East. Scottish-born Frances Calderón de la Barca traveled to Mexico in 1840 with her husband, the Spanish minister to the United States. Her excellent account of life there is the first book about Mexico by a woman. Lady Florentia Sales, a journal of the disasters in Afghanistan, published in 1843, is the dramatic, tragic story of the slaughter of British forces as they retreated from Afghanistan in 1842. Florentia Sales was there with her husband, Bob Henry Sale, fighting Bob Sale of the British Army, and she was an eyewitness to events as well as temporarily a prisoner of Afghan warlords. Lady Sale faithfully followed her husband into several battles until 1845, when he was killed in the First Sikh War. Her journal remains an immensely readable, objective rendering of a ghastly episode, and apparently one from which future generations did not learn. Here is an unusual example of a travel narrative by a Middle Eastern woman, Maria Teresa Asmar, the memoirs of a Babylonian princess, the daughter of the Emir Abdullah Asmar, written by herself and translated into English and published in London, 1844. It colorfully recounts her life in Iraq and travels through Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon, often in the company of Arab Bedouins. And another woman who made Lebanon famous was Lady Hester Stanhope, and her account of life in Lebanon, published in 1845, edited by her physician, Charles Marion. But she abandoned England for the Levant many years early in 1810 and remained there with a large entourage until her death in 1839. In addition to being an adventurous traveler, she was an antiquarian and archaeologist, and these memoirs made her famous and notorious. Author and illustrator Louisa Ann Meredith traveled from England to New South Wales and Tasmania in 1839 and became a tireless promoter of the region. Her travel narratives were written specifically for the English audience, encouraging immigration. This is her first book on the left and her second book on the right. And it was followed by a treatise on the flora of Tasmania entitled Some of My Bush Friends in Tasmania, in which her illustrations were reproduced in extraordinary chromolithographs. This is one of the most remarkable books, beautiful books in the collection, at least from a standpoint of book production. Susanna Moody's Roughing It in the Bush is an extraordinary account of a pioneer woman and her adventures in Upper Canada in the 1830s, which she wrote about with a sense of humor and gusto. It is part of a trilogy Moody wrote about the immigrant experience. Larry had this first edition, as well as a later 1930 scholarly edition, and undoubtedly it was an important historical text for an author of fiction about the lives of women on the plains. Emily Lowe wrote two narratives about travels with her mother, the first to Norway, Denmark, and Sweden in 1857, followed by Sicily in 1859. She was famous for the comment, quote, "The only use for a gentleman in traveling is to look after the luggage," end quote. The clever Miss Lowe also coined the often used expression unprotected females. And indeed, she was proud and even boastful about traveling unaccompanied by a man. And here's the frontispiece of her work on Sicily, I think probably from a drawing by her daughter. English novelist and poet Amelia Edwards wrote the first general archaeological survey of Egypt's ruins, an important and pioneering work that became one of the foundations of the field of Egyptology. Here are two examples of the remarkable decorated covers of her book, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, published in 1877. She also wrote about climbing the Dolomites, but she is most famous today as the author of ghost stories. She was an extraordinary writer and traveler. Lady Anna Brassey was one of the most celebrated Victorian women travelers. Between 1878 and 1887, she wrote 5 accounts of travels around the world in her famous schooner, the Sunbeam, which was designed and built specifically for her. The books about her adventures were elaborate productions with fine photography, lithography, and other illustrations. Her 5th voyage was her final one, alas. She contracted malaria not far from Australia and died in the Sunbeam, where she was buried at sea in 1887 at age 48. And there's the last voyage. Isabella Bird is also another one of the most celebrated and documented women travelers of her time. Beginning in 1856, she visited and wrote about the United States, the Sandwich Islands, followed by Japan, Persia, Kurdistan, Tibet, and China. She was a globetrotter extraordinaire, a woman of vigorous personality and phenomenal energy, and she accomplished her travels and explorations while suffering from a debilitating spinal infirmity. In 1882, Isabella Bird was the first woman to address the Royal Geographical Society. In 1883, she was the first woman to be made a member of the society. Lucy Garnett's The Women of Turkey and Their Folklore is the first of several books by her about Turkey, Greece, and the Middle East, and it's an extraordinary work of scholarship. Her studies covered a wide range of women from indigenous groups, including the Volchas, Greeks, Armenians, Bulgarians, Kurdish, Albanians, Tartars, and Gypsies. And she closely examined and wrote about their festivals, ceremonies, intermarriages, and literature. Mary Kingsley, niece of novelist Charles Kingsley, went to West Africa on expeditions to explore and learn, and her achievements were enormous. She discovered a new species of fish and a rare unknown lizard, both of which she returned home with in pickle jars and presented to the British Museum. She wrote extensive ethnological field studies and became a highly respected spokeswoman on behalf of Africans, damning missionaries and colonists alike. The two travel accounts she produced were immediate bestsellers. The fish species she identified was named for her, and here it is. Kingsley went to South Africa to help with nursing during the Boer War, contracted a disease, and died there. Like Lady Brassey, she was buried at sea off the coast of South Africa at age 37. Mary Helen Hitchcock's Two Women's in the Klondike, published in 1899 with his wonderful designer cover, which is not signed, alas. We don't know who designed that cover. Gary Kurtz, in his Klondike bibliography, wrote that this is, quote, one of the most compelling, entertaining, and improbable eyewitness accounts of the Klondike or of any gold rush. I have juxtaposed it here with Olive Percival's Mexico City and Idler's Notebook, the Southern Californian's first book, published in 1901, a charming series of sketches based on her travels in Mexico, with a wonderful cover design by Frank Hazenplug. Dorothy Mills, Lady Dorothy Mills, a glamorous socialite, ran away from a staid upper-class English life to venture out into the world to become a travel writer, and Timbuktu was the first place she chose to visit. She traveled 3 months across the Sahara Desert and down the Niger River to become the first European woman to enter Timbuktu. Her account of that journey, published in 1924, was the first of her 5 travel narratives. So we've arrived at about 1925 in the publication sequence of these books, and have only seen a sampling of the interesting stories in the collection. A sampling which I hope has conveyed insight as to why Larry McMurtry was so taken, indeed captivated, with his women travelers, his runaways, as he liked to call them, and why he rebuffed efforts over the years to part with the collection. I didn't want to part with it either, honestly, but I was honored to have it while I did, to catalog it, learn from it, and smile with it as I immersed myself into these wonderful tales. It is a remarkable book collection that began, as many remarkable book collections do, with the unintentional accumulation of a few books, which spark ideas that lead to more books and gradually to a larger collection that evolves into an important contribution to the historical record. And not all collections like this survive the collector who made them. Upon their passing, many get dispersed and scattered, as I feared this one would. I was fortunate to secure it and shepherd it into a permanent home at the Gollier Library at SMU, where it will remain as the Larry McMurtry collection of books by women travelers. Here's the final image I'm going to show. It's of Mabel Loomis Todd of Amherst, Massachusetts, sitting on a camel in the desert of Libya, peering back at the photographer, shielding her eyes from the sun. The image appeared as an illustration in her travel narrative, Tripoli, the Mysterious, published in 1910, so I regress a bit in the chronology. Todd is best known today as one of the first editors of Emily Dickinson's poetry, but her life and travels were multifaceted, often lively, and sometimes controversial. When I first opened this book and saw this remarkably playful photographic illustration, I was sure Mabel Loomis Todd, like so many of the authors in this collection, was speaking to the reader, saying something, but I was not sure what it was until it came to me the first time I gave this talk. She is clearly saying, John, your time is up. Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. I'll go ahead. These are more some of the covers of books. You can't. You can, if you have questions.
Yeah, well, let's see if we have any questions here in the covers. Yes.
John, when you bought that collection, was it always your intention to sell it en bloc?
Absolutely.
To one buyer?
Yes, absolutely. I was not going to let it get broken up.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I was asked if I intended to sell it en bloc. I was not going to let that collection go little piece by piece. I would have taken it somewhere and shelved it and kept it up, even adding to it books in Larry's want list that he hadn't found, which I have found some of those. So no, it was going to stay as a collection.
So he started out in San Francisco, and that apparently that purchase at Holmes, which is of course a marvel in those days, was a marvel. So when did you finally meet him? Somewhere when you were working at Serendipity, perhaps?
Not until I purchased the Brick Road Bookshop. I've been asked when did I first meet Larry, and then I sort of had an entree to him because he knew Franklin Gillum and knew the Brick Road Bookshop in the Texas days.
At some point in San Solano Avenue, wasn't he?
No, he was here in downtown San
When he
Francisco.
was in San Francisco. Yeah. And then did you know he was very close with Peter Howard?
Larry or
Larry.
But they knew each other.
Yeah, because he was it was immense.
And Smith.
Yes, of the books that you read, are there a couple that you'd like to see republished?
Well, there's some that haven't been reprinted, but many of them are in print or have been reprinted, are available as used books. I can't, there's so many that are favorites, and I haven't read every one, so I guess I can't. I'm not capable of answering that. Let's have lunch someday, Ann, and we'll talk.
Too big of a question for today. Carol.
Well, that was what I wanted to ask. Your own reading and also Larry McMurtry's reading the books.
Well, there are too many of them do that. I didn't even touch on Gertrude Bell, Freya Stark. There are so many that are wonderful books that so it's hard for me to pick out a favorite or a couple of favorites like that. I've never been good at that on any subject. Sorry. Yes.
So I work in an archive. I'm wondering if you made a conscious decision to sell these books en masse to a university, or if you were willing to sell them to a private collector. Was there a conscious decision about that, or?
I didn't think that I didn't look for a private collector to buy them. I went right away for an institution, and one in Texas that might want it, returned to them in very good condition, properly cataloged. So that was my goal, and I fortunately it worked out.
Thank you for your service.
Kevin, thank you. John, it seems like much of the collection focused on authors from Britain. Did it also include like the Abbey sisters, the Americans, wrote about their time in China?
Yeah, there are a lot of those books, but again, of all those titles to mention them, and there are French women travelers, German, Swedish. Frederica Bremer is from Sweden, so there are a lot of them in the collection. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Other questions?
Well, then the ones you were showing, were those ones that he may have acquired somewhat toward the end because they were fairly expensive, do you think?
Hard to say. The earlier ones were the more expensive ones.
Yeah.
So the ones in the first 150
And
years.
then he perhaps got those at auction.
Yeah, I think he did. I actually have records of us buying them at auction.
And of course, all that went to the library.
Yes.
So they've got an incredible archive. Are they committed to perhaps enlarging the collection?
They are. Yeah. So here are 3 books about Larry. If any of you are interested, Tracy Daugherty wrote a really fine biography of Larry that was published a couple years ago. That was added to recently by David Streitfeld, who this book came out 2 months ago. They're both excellent biographies. They kind of begin in the same place and end in the same place, but get there, the journey's a little different, and they're both well worth reading. And this is a collection of essays by fellow writers on the life and legend of Larry McMurtry. All 3 books are really well worth reading if you're interested in McMurtry.
We are at the top of the hour, so if there's one last question here, I'm going to share the Zoom questions with you afterwards because we're at the top of the hour, and some of them are very detailed and specific. So we probably don't want to go into them here, but we'll share them with you later. Is there any last words you want to give to the audience?
No, thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Say goodbye.
Okay, yep.
So again, join me in thanking our speaker, John Crichton. Again, I know you're all clapped out. That was a great talk. And thanks for attending this Book Club of California program. We hope you'll join us for another book club program. We're here almost every Monday in person or on Zoom or both. So check us out online at bccbooks.org/programs and register for another program. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.